Okay, so this is part 7, the final part of this series, and I call it From Teshuva to Zionism. I want to take as I said before, there are 4 levels of Teshuva for Rav Kook. There's the individual Teshuva, which itself has about 4 levels. And then there's the Teshuva, national Teshuva, which is the people coming back to its land and to its tradition. Then there is international Teshuva, which is the whole world walking in the right pathway of justice and belief. And universal tshuva, meaning after mankind does the right thing, so sort of like automatically the rest of creation follows suit. This is his belief. So you have tshuvat ha'adam, ha'am, ha'olam, ve'yukum, everything. So yeah, tshuvat ha'prat, ha'adam ha'prati, ha'am, b'nei ha'adam ve'ha'olam. That's not how I would say it. Those are the 4 levels of tshuva: the individual, the nation of Israel, mankind, and the world. So I'm talking about again the teshuva on the national level. The national level, of course, this is a famous statement by Rav Kook, so I'll read it right here. Which one is it? It's this one. I might have mentioned this earlier when we talked another time about Geula. The first generation of the footsteps of the Messiah, Rav Kook uses this term, which is from the Mishnah in Sota, chapter 9, which refers to the beginning of redemption as the footsteps of the Messiah. It's sort of like you haven't seen the Mashiach yet, but you can see his footsteps. Because according to our rabbis, redemption is a process which happens slowly. As the Midrash says in Esther Rabbah and also the Talmud Yerushalmi, about 4 rabbis that were walking in the valley of Arbel, and they saw the first light of the morning, and they said, this is the way the redemption of Israel happens. First, it's a very small light, and then it grows stronger until the darkness disappears. So it's a gradual process. The first generation of the footsteps of Mashiach, at the beginning of the revealed end, what is this term, the revealed end? This is a term taken from the Talmud, also in Sanhedrin, where Rabbi Abba, who is a student of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and a first-generation Amorah in the land of Israel, he says, Ein lecha ketz meguleh mizeh, you have no better proof, testimony, that the redemption is coming. What is the best proof? When you see the land of Israel blossoming with its fruit and its vegetation, because it says in Yeshayahu and Isaiah, V'atem harei Yisrael, O you, the mountains of Israel, Anfechem titenu, give forth your branches, Upiriachem tisu lami Yisrael, and give forth your fruit to the people of Israel, Ki kervu lavo, because it's going to happen very soon. So that's this term, Shalom Yonatan. So I'm talking about 2 terms of Rav Kook here. One term is when he uses the term, the footsteps of Messiah. This is a Mishnaic term from the Mishnah and Sota, which refers to the first part of the process of redemption, because I said there's also a Midrash and a Yerushalmi which talks about redemption as a process, as a gradual process. And this is called the footsteps of Messiah. I mean, we don't see the Messianic age, but we see the footsteps of the Mashiach. It's like you're following him in the sand or in the snow. So you know it's coming soon. And even the term, the revealed end, Ketza Meguleh, is a term in the Talmud in Sanhedrin, Rabbi Abba, the student of Shimon Bar Yochai, who says that this is the best testimony that it's coming. When you see the land of Israel bearing its fruit, then this is a sign that you're getting close. Why is it a sign that you're getting close? Because in Leviticus, in Vayikra, chapter 27, which is Parshat Bechukotai, which we're going to read soon. Right, next week is Bahar. I don't know if it's the double Parsha next week or not. but after Bahar is Bechukotai. So in Parsha Bechukotai, which is the first place in the Torah which talks about the klalot, the curses, there is a curse. Part of the curse is it says, Bashimoti ani et haaretz. I shall make the land barren. It shall lay waste. Vishamemu aleha oivechem hayoshvim ba, which is a double entendre. It's using the same word as a homonym, meaning the land will be waste, will be barren, but your enemies will be astonished from the word lihishtomem, but it's the same root. And your enemies will be astonished at how barren this land is. Rashi, writing in the 11th century, says that this verse is not a curse but a blessing. And it's to tell you that as long as the Jews are not in the land of Israel, no nation will be able to build it up. It'll just remain desolate the whole time. Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, wrote about his experiences in his travels abroad in the Middle East in a book called Innocents Abroad. It's part of the collection of his books, Innocents Abroad. In that book, he is traveling through Palestine, and he says, anybody who can see the barrenness of this land, meaning sand dune and empty mountain one after another, is reminded of the verse in Leviticus 27 that says, I shall bring the land into waste and your enemies shall be astonished. It's funny, he quotes that verse. This was in 1888, just after the first Aliyah, Innocents Abroad. I always found that interesting. So that's why, according to the Talmud, according to Rabbi Abba, if Israel is not waste, but is bringing its fruit, that's a sign that the land realizes that the Jews are coming back. Meaning it, Rabbeinu Asher the Ramban, Nachmanides, in the 13th century, who actually came to Israel at the end of his life. He says, and the nations will not succeed. He says, I've been to Israel, and it is barren. Exactly like it says. They haven't been able to build it up. And his student, Rabbeinu Asher ben Asher, says they won't even be able to successfully build it up until the young birds come back to the nest. That's Bachya ben Asher, reigning in the 14th century. And this is the way it was. If you've seen a picture of Tel Aviv, 1905, just sand dunes next to Jaffa. Netanya, 1910, sand dunes. Eilat, 1950, sand dunes. So it was a very barren area. But this idea that the Talmud says this is a sign of the beginning of the inkling of redemption is that the land of Israel starts bearing its fruit because it knows that its children are coming back. So, the first generation of the footsteps of Messiah, which is in the beginning of the revealed end, which is the settlement of the land of Israel, settling the land physically, building houses, cultivating the land, defending it. This prepares the material element of the congregation of Israel. Congregation of Israel is an idea, Knesset Yisrael. It means the collective Jewish people. And spirituality at this time will only serve to preserve the inner life. Meaning when the people come back to their land, it's like the soul of the Jewish people are regaining their body, their national body. The land is the body. But just as a child grows up, and first they have to learn how to eat, and how to crawl, and how to walk, and only much later do they learn how to think, how to discuss. So too, when the land of Israel is coming back, first all the physical elements will be the most important. Cultivating the land, building the houses, creating agricultural areas, creating a police force and a government and whatever. All these things had to happen, and spirituality will be there, but it'll be on the back burner. Because like you take somebody out of slavery, you have to give them a good meal. You have to give them a bath. You have to give them clothes. You have to give them time to come back to themselves. The Jews need time to come back to themselves. But when the physical power of the nation will be strong, then all the holy spiritual virtues will be revealed in it. The light of Torah, the Torah with its light, will return to be the light of the world, a crown of glory in the hand of God, a crown of royalty in the palm of the God of Israel. This is a verse in Isaiah. In other words, eventually, to paraphrase, when the people comes back to its land, it's going to be very interested in the nationalistic and physical aspects of the creation of Zionism. But once we've come to that point where we feel some stability, the next question is going to be, what is the culture and the inner values that we want to accord to this entity? And that's when the ideas of Judaism will be entertained in a more significant way. This is what Rav Kook believes. He says you have to understand it's a process. You can't push it, but it will happen. Somebody once said that when a nation speaks the same language and has the same culture and the same land, eventually they adopt their same traditions, because that's just the way it works, in a sense. I want to show you something else of Rav Kook, which I find one of the most interesting for me. I think I mentioned Philippe in our previous talk when we talked about redemption. I find this one of the most interesting quotes of Rav Kook from his book Arpelei Tohar. I have it only in Hebrew here, but I will translate. The first generation of the footsteps of Messiah, he's saying the same thing, in the same time period, at the beginning of the Case of Megillah, excuse me, wait, I didn't want that one. Oh no, this is the one I wanted. This is also interesting. Okay. Cook writes this in our Torah, and this is one of the reasons, by the way, that it took a long time for the book to be published, because for a long time Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook didn't want it published, but eventually they did, because he was afraid people wouldn't understand. Cook writes, sometimes when you need a transgression on the words of the Torah, you need a transgression on the words of the Torah. Why would you need a transgression? Why would you have to transgress the Torah? I'm continuing. And there's nobody in the generation who can show the way. It happens by an outpouring, like a burst of energy. Heat pursuit. Rav Kook is not saying 100% what he means, but it's quite obvious what he means. What Rav Kook means is like this, and I'll explain it in my own words. There were early Zionists before Herzl. You had the students, you had the Hasidim who came to Israel in the late 18th century. You had from Lithuania and Belarus, people came. In 1808, you had students of the Vilna Gaon, and these people did settle the land to a certain point. They did come to Tzfat, they came to Yerushalayim. By 1850, Yerushalayim was majority Jewish, 4,000 out of the 8,000 various peoples that were living there. You had the Chibat Zion Russian Zionist movement, which was established somewhere around 1870, before Herzl. At that year, Herzl was only born in 1860, so he was only 10 years old when they established the Chibat Zion Russian Zionist movement, which you might say was responsible for the first Aliyah in 1882. However, what Herzlian Zionism did, and specifically the second Aliyah, that Aliyah of Brenner and Ben Gurion and Borochov and Agnon and etc. These were ideologues who had a very practical agenda of how they wanted to build up a state. And sometimes Rav Kook says there's certain things that needed to happen in the state of Israel that if you had to ask the rabbis, it wouldn't work. The most obvious example is, should we have an army? Now, if you're talking about giving people rifles just to protect their settlement, okay. We got that. But having an army where you can go to war and people are going to die, because that's what happens in wars, to conquer land, which rabbi is going to give that heter? Nobody that Rav Kook could think of at his time. So what you needed like a Trumpeldor who had fought in the Russian army and was an officer, but was a Jew who was not exactly traditional. You need somebody like that. You need rebellious Jews who would be what we call verbrent, we say in Yiddish, who would be gung ho on the idea of building up a land of Israel, who would understand that there's a cost. Because most of the rabbis would not accept the cost. How am I going to tell people to sacrifice their kids to conquer land when we've been living in the diaspora all these years? You know, when I worked in Beit Tzfutot in Tel Aviv, they had a downstairs one of these changing exhibits, and it was about Nachum Sokolov, who was an early Zionist, but didn't spend a lot of time in Israel. It was more a roaming Zionist from England, from the United States. And Sokolov was interviewed in a video, and he said, I once had a discussion with David Ben-Gurion. And David says to me, he says, Nachum, I'm a bigger Zionist than you are. And Sokolov says, I said to Ben-Gurion, why are you bigger than me? So Ben-Gurion says, because I did things that you would never dare do for the state of Israel. He says, what do you mean? He says, in 1948, in the middle of the War of Independence, I took Shoah survivors off the boats, send them off to the Battle of Latrun, giving them a rifle in hand, knowing that a third of them would not come back. And you couldn't do that. He's right. And no rabbi, Russia, Poland, or Lithuania would have been able to say, do that. You needed people who thought differently, Jews who thought differently. Now, I have to say something about Ben-Gurion, though, and specifically about that, since I told that story with Nachum Sokolov, because I think Ben-Gurion also had things that made him feel that way. Remember, the state of Israel was 3 years after the Shoah. The feeling was we have our back against the wall. It's either a state or back to square one all over again. There's a famous story. A few weeks before May the 14th, 1948, which was Yom Ha'atzmaut, Harry Truman, an envoy, goes from the Jewish agency, which is the shadow cabinet, to Harry Truman. Truman says to them, don't proclaim a state. It's too dangerous. We have intelligence. 7 Arab armies are going to attack you. We don't think you'll survive it. Why do you want it? Let us negotiate. Give us time. Don't do it. They came back. They told Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion said to Yigal Allon, who was his minister of intelligence at the time, said, Yigal, what do you think? What are our chances of surviving a battle against 7 Arab armies? Allon says, David, not better than 50-50. Ben-Gurion says, Yigal, in the last 2,000 years, when did the Jewish people have such good odds at winning back the land of Israel? But even though that's a cute story, I really think that Ben-Gurion felt his back was against the wall. That the Shoah proved that it was worth the price that he knew that they were going to pay. And, sometimes there are a lot of people who know what the price could be. I always say, I didn't make this up, somebody else did, but I think it's a lovely quote. I saw this on Facebook, I think just last year. Somebody said we have 2 commemorative days. One of them is Yom HaShoah, and one of them is Yom HaZikaron, and they're 1 week apart. Yom HaZikaron is the day where we remember the price we had to pay for the state of Israel. Yom HaShoah reminds us of the price we have to pay when we don't have a state of Israel. So I really think that Ben-Gurion, who was a very level-headed person, even though I'm sure he had enemies, and it's easy to criticize any leader, but he felt that this is a price that we had to pay. And he was probably right. Sokolov wouldn't have done it. He was a different type of Zionist. Now I'm going to reread you what Rav Kook is saying now, and I think you'll understand. Sometimes it happens in history that you have to transgress Torah. What it means to transgress Torah? You're not really transgressing Torah. You're sending men into a situation which is going to cost them their lives. Who's going to calculate such a thing? Especially when the country hasn't even been established. And there's nobody in that generation who can show the way because people are all mixed up. What are we supposed to do? When push comes to shove, how do we actually create a land, take responsibility for it? So it happens by a burst, an outburst, meaning it happens a way that nobody even fathomed. And that's why it's better that this happens ishkaga, meaning it happens inadvertently, meaning by people who are far away from the tradition. So this is the way they understood it. They had good intentions, but even for the times they succeeded, and even for the times when they did not. And this has to do with the basic principle of the Talmud, that sometimes it's better for somebody to do a transgression inadvertently than on purpose. That's a famous Talmud in Beitza, page 30, it says about certain women who were eating on Yom Kippur between the time you light the candles and when the sun set, which officially, rabbinically, is not allowed, but from the Torah Zadain is still allowed. So the Talmud says, don't tell them, because if you tell them they'll do it on purpose. It's better they do it inadvertently than on purpose. There's a whole discussion there in the halacha. In what case do you say that? Are we talking only about rabbinic things? There's a discussion there. Rav Kook says, only when there was prophecy in Israel, we have a way of mending such a thing by a temporary law, because a prophet was allowed to do a temporary amendment of the law. The famous example brought in the Talmud is Elijah on Mount Carmel. When Eliyahu was at Mount Carmel, the temple was already built in Jerusalem. So sacrifices were only allowed to be brought in Jerusalem, because it says in Devarim, in the place that God chose, Hamakom asher yivchar Hashem. But Eliyahu realized that he had to have a showdown with the prophets of the Baal in front of everybody, and he couldn't go down. He didn't have time to go down to Jerusalem to prove the point. It had to be right here on Mount Carmel. So a prophet is allowed to do a temporary breach of the law when the ends justifies the means, but it has to be temporary. It can't be all the time. You can't say from now on you can bring sacrifices on Mount Carmel. It's called Hora'at Sha'ah, which is what the Talmud calls it. When it happens this way, it happens legally. And it's even a mitzvah to follow the Navi. But if you don't have prophecy, when the light of prophecy is over, the only way you can make this amendment is by an outpouring, which is sad by itself, but its end result will bring happiness. Rav Kook had a very clear understanding of the generation that he was part of. Maybe even clearer than the people who lived themselves around him. It's almost shocking how the way he understood exactly what that generation was about. These were rebellious Jews who came all from religious families, from Russia and Poland and Lithuania, but they were very Jewish, very Zionist, very committed to the Jewish people, put the people of Israel first before their own personal desires. That's why they left everything to come to these crazy kibbutzi and till the land and the settlements. And Rav Kook understood that God has a lot of emissaries. And it could even happen this way. There's a story, maybe I told it, about a student in Merkaz Rav Yeshiva, came to Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook, the son, in his last years. He said, Rav Kook, there are people who say that we're not allowed to join the Zionist movement or the government because there are secular people there who don't keep the Torah. And you're not allowed to be involved with them. So Tzvira said, Yesh lecha kushiyot al HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So, in other words, your questions are about God. It's not about that. God, for some reason, wanted these people to bring us to the land of Israel. So you have a question, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ask him. What does it have to do with what we're doing? In other words, that's the way it happened. And Jews who believe in divine providence and hashgacha pratit, if these people of the second Aliyah, these rebellious people, these were the Zionists, that's what God wanted. And sometimes, Rav Kook says, in history, you need things to happen in such a way because it probably would have taken hundreds of years if you wanted the rabbis to decide when to do it. And we didn't have the time to wait. So another interesting. Any questions about that piece?
Yes, if you allow me, Rav Shukrat.
Oh, yes, of course, Philippe, s'il vous plaît.
Yes, I'm repeating myself with my questions because I really have a hard time why you are using the word sad and also why rebellious, because a posteriori, we know that those Jews were right. Staying in Europe for any longer meant to be the victim of occupation or the other anti-Semites that destroyed European Judaism. So why is saving one's life and saving the lives of others something rebellious? Because a posteriori, we know, but we have the luxury and the comfort, of course, of being born much later. And I can
hindsight is always 2020.
Yes, it's easy to talk like that at Israel 75 years, but nevertheless, history has proven that they were right. So how can they be coined as rebellious?
Look,
if they are?
Because we're talking about the second Aliyah. This is from 1905 to 1920, something like that.
Yes.
In this time, the Jews living in Poland, okay, there were difficulties. I'm not saying not, but you have major Jewish establishments. You have yeshivot, you have synagogues. I mean, Jewish life is thriving in Poland, in Lithuania, even parts of Russia. As it comes closer, of course, things start changing towards the war. Rav Kook writes in the book Orot, in what's called a Milchama, he says, when a great war is about to arise in the world, it calls the sounds of Messiah, which means great changes take place. And Rav Kook felt that the First World War was a watershed moment. He did not live through the Second World War. He died in 1935.
Yes.
And at his time, a lot of rabbis didn't like the fact that you had all these rebellious Jews who left the yeshivot to settle the land of Israel. What's the point? We say mipnei chatainu galinu me'artzenu. We say in Musaf, we left the land of Israel because of our sins, so we're going to go back to the land and sin. But as Rav Kook says, that's a simplistic way of looking at what's going on. There's sometimes you have to see things as part of a process. And sometimes you have to understand that things have to happen a certain way because our own national consciousness does not allow us to do some of the things that these people figured out that they had to do.
Yes, Rav Shukrat. But at the same time, Jews were living in terrible material poverty in Europe.
Yes.
Not all of them, but most of them. And so they had a choice. And we do not have to underestimate the anti-Semitism that was virulent in France. Witnessed it with the Dreyfus trial, and Luger in Vienna was shouting anti-Semitic diatribes almost every week. Europe was very anti-Semitic in that time, and people were maybe scared for their lives.
And the funny thing is that Western European Jews were non-Zionists. They saw absolutely no reason to make Aliyah. All the early Olim were all from Russia, Poland, Lithuania, Romania.
Yes, where there were pogroms, there were waves of pogroms over there.
There was no emancipation, meaning Jews realized if they wanted ever to become equal citizens, they would have to do it themselves. Like Leon Pinsker's book, Auto Emancipation, who was the director general of the Chibat Zion Russian Zionist movement.
So my assumption, so I understand from your answer that my assumption is wrong. So the Jews are not running for their lives to the land of Israel.
At this point, no. The running to the lives starts from the 1930s.
Yes. So
until the 1920s,
yes,
Jewish life it's not great, but there's a modus vivendi in Eastern Europe. It's not great, but also the Russian Revolution changes everything. Because the Russian Revolution, actually, Jews are again optimistic that the communists are going to give us equal rights because that's what Lenin talked about. So Jews really thought that communism would be the salvation of the Jews in Russia, and a lot of Jews rebelled, and instead of going to Israel, they threw off the talis and tefillin and just became communists.
Yes, I understand that, but I want to understand if it's an oversimplification to say that those Jews were very intelligent and were able to see the signs of a great destruction in Europe. And that
I would not jump ahead and assume that. I think that they felt that the best way to create a new life for the Jews and take them out of the ghetto was to come back to the land of Israel. And they wanted to pioneer it, and they had some ideas. I would say the earliest Zionist movement was not able to think that far ahead. Remember, when Herzl comes along in 1897, the only thing they can really agree upon as a platform is that the state of Israel, eventual state of Israel, will be a shelter for Jews against anti-Semitism. So that's what they could agree upon. But they couldn't even think like Asher Ginsburg, Ahad Ha'am, talked about the state of Israel being a cultural center. That seemed too far in the future to even discuss at this point. So it's very hard for them to see ahead. I always say that the early Zionists, they wanted the baby to be born, but they couldn't see that far ahead of how we're going to bring him up, because it just seemed too fantastic to even discuss that point when you don't even know if the baby will be born or not. That's what I'm saying. So they're living much earlier, by the 1930s. Rav Kook, by the way, who dies in 1935, in one of his articles in the book Ma'amarei Raya, he talks about the rise of Hitler. This is an article he writes, I think, in 1934. And he's talking about, and he says on Rosh Hashanah, you have to blow a kosher shofar from a kosher animal, meaning. But even if you blow from a non-kosher animal, you can do so if you don't have a kosher shofar. I mean, a non-kosher horn. But he says, we say, Takab shofar gadol cherutenu, blow the great shofar to sound our freedom. But we don't want to blow a non-kosher shofar. And he's referring there to Hitler. He doesn't want Hitler to be the one who's going to force the Jews to come to Israel. Meaning he was afraid that Hitler would be the catalyst of Jews running away to the land of Israel. He says, that's not what we want. We want them to come out of their own volition. But that's what happened to a certain extent. But the second, third, fourth aliyah, no, those are the conferences. The second aliyah is basically idealistic. It's not like the German Jews who are running away from Germany. It's idealistic. From the 30s, almost up to present day, most of the aliyot are running away from somewhere, refugees from somewhere. Whether it's Germany and then the Shoah, and then the Arab countries, and then Poland in 56 to 58, and then Soviet Union in the 70s, and then Ethiopia in the 80s, and the former Soviet Union in the 90s. I mean, our whole history is Jewish refugees coming to the land of Israel.
Yes, I understand. But is it so sad for, I would say, traditional Judaism that the settlers and the conquerors of the 20th century do not observe Shabbat and do not eat kosher? Is that so sad after we see all the benefits?
It is sad when you believe in the Torah, when you see people who came from religious families and threw it off, yes. But the happy part is that they didn't throw off the shackles of being Jewish.
Yes.
They used their nationalist Zionist identity as a new identity of what for them it was to be a Jew. This was not an anti-Jewish move. You might say it was an anti-religious move, but it was not an anti-Jewish move. They wanted to create a new identity. Whether they were
Yes.
able to bring that identity to their children and grandchildren, sometimes yes, sometimes no. But these people had a very strong Jewish identity, and they wanted to create a new identity which they thought would be befitting what they were trying to do in Israel. Okay, I'll just go. We can still ask questions after him, but because in about 15 minutes I'll have to join my class here tonight, so I can't go overboard. I just want to read something, another ket of Rav Kook from the book Orot, where he talks about what is Jewish nationalism. I also find this interesting. What are the differences between Jewish nationalism to nationalism of every other nation and tongue? Is that normally nationalism is a feeling of a people have a certain mentality, create a certain national mentality, and that national mentality is very much like the individual mentality, and it develops naturally in a certain place. In other words, nationalism is a people come to a certain country, a certain geography, with a certain temperature, certain culture, and they create a culture, and it becomes a culture of everybody, a cooperative culture of the people living there, and all those people living there with the shared experiences, that becomes the nationalism of that country. He says, however, Jewish nationalism, and he's of course talking about Zionism, because Zionism is Jewish nationalism. Jewish nationalism is based on very deep ethical commitment, very profound ethical commitment, or responsibility, I should say. And this ethical commitment needs to be developed. And it cannot be developed just naturally. When we keep the mitzvot, which is the nourishment of the inner life of the nation of Israel, it has all the nutrients this ethical nationalism needs in order to make this nation of values. I'm paraphrasing. What Rav Kook is saying is that Jewish nationalism is not just nationalism, because you cannot disconnect it from the Torah. The Torah is the way we think as Jews, and nationalism is how we relate to the land. And he believes that it's like a body and a soul, and it has to be connected. It says when it's connected, then Jewish nationalism becomes a sense of ethical responsibility. I actually would say, to his credit, the state of Israel actually partially sees itself that way. We see ourselves as protecting Jews wherever they might be. We're happy to share our technology and to help countries in time of disaster. And we see that as a feather in our cap, something that we're proud of. So despite the fact that we're small in numbers. So I think for a certain sense, and these are people, let's say, who, I would say a lot of people in Israel, like some of our American, Jews, for them, Judaism also has the idea of tikkun olam, of mending the world, which we also believe in, but we believe that's part of Judaism and not all of Judaism. But it's definitely part of it. And if you want to say that Jewish nationalism is also about bending the world, that's also true. But of course, first and foremost, it's building up a Jewish nation with its tradition and its cultures. This is part of the struggle we're going through now. And I really think that if we had more people teaching Rav Kook, the struggle would be a lot easier and less bitter. Because Rav Kook, as I showed you last time, is extremely inclusive in his thinking. Much more than even some of his proponents talk about. When I talked about the 4-level song, the song of the individual, the song of the nation, the song of the world, the song of mankind, the song of the world, Rav Kook does not see paradoxes between these things. It's all together. We're part of a nation, we're individuals, we're part of the world. And I also mentioned last time the famous quote of Manitou, of Leon Ashkenazi, who used to say that when a Jew is in the diaspora, they can be cosmopolitan, meaning they can feel part of a larger culture. But in the end of the day, Einstein, his contribution was as Einstein physics. It wasn't the Jewish people. And Freud's contribution was as an individual. But when an Israeli from Haifa University or Hebrew University gets a Nobel Prize, all of a sudden it's the Jewish people got a Nobel Prize. That's just the way the world sees us. So he said, only in the land of Israel can we actually be universal, because we're now on the stage, on the world stage, and everybody's looking at us. So what we do is going to affect the world one way or another, whether they're willing to admit it or not. There was a very cute thing. I was listening to Natan Datner on the Israeli radio, Galei Tzal, the day after Yom Ha'atzmaut. So Datner, who's an Israeli actor in Beit Lessin, the Camry, he says, I was speaking to a colleague of mine in Europe, and they said to me, Natan, what's all this infighting going on in Israel? You got these guys going this way, these guys protesting that way. What's going on? He says, you're such a wonderful nation. Why are you trying to ruin it? So Datner says, this is the first time they said something nice about us in the state of Israel. Do we have to fight in order for them to say something nice about us? Can't they just say something nice about it any other time? So I always say, people see this. A lot of people find the state of Israel a very interesting place, but Israelis are sometimes very myopic. They don't realize that the world is looking at us. And sometimes with, I would say, almost with jealousy that there's something going on here, that we have causes that we're willing to fight for. So I'm just saying that, anyhow, Rav Kook is a big believer that there are things going on here. And we need people who can teach that there are things going on here, and everybody has a role to play in the story. It's not a story of one group or another group. You know, the Aliyah to the land of Israel has been the biggest challenge of our history since the destruction of the Second Temple. Because if you look at Jews in the diaspora, there are usually isolated communities. Okay, you got Jews in England. First of all, they all speak English. They're mostly Ashkenazi. Okay, today you have more Sephardim, but vast majority. The Jews in France, they mostly today came from North Africa. So, you know, the Ashkenazi ones sort of like disappeared. The Jews in Germany today, they mostly came from Russia. It's like the new wave of people. Jews in the United States today, there's still a vast majority from Ashkenazi countries, etc. In Israel, you have Jews from probably 50 countries, if not more. And it's the first time in our history, everybody's got to live together. We're not used to that. You know, in Montreal, when I lived in Montreal, if you didn't want to see a Hasidic Jew, it wasn't a problem. You didn't have to visit the Hasidic houses in Outremont. You didn't have to go to their stores. There are other places you could go. You could live as a Jew and never see a Hasidic Jew in your life. In Israel, we're all on the same ship. Even if they're in a different cabin or on a different level, we're all on the same ship. It's a real challenge of inclusivity. How do I live with all these people together? It's one of the biggest challenges we've had since the Second Temple. It's not a simple thing. I would say we're relatively successful, and we should be successful because there's no other choice. And we should see, as Pierre Elliott Trudeau said, we should see multiculturalism as a blessing. So it's multi-Jewish culturalism, but it's a blessing. But yes, it's definitely a challenge. I don't say no. So I'm just saying Rav Kook had a lot of interesting things to relate to this. I will say one last thing in the name of Rav Kook, if I can find it. I'll close this guy. There's something else here. Where did I put it? Let's see, share screen. Okay, this one, because we did start from Orot HaTshuva, so we'll end with Orot HaTshuva, even though I only have a few minutes. But how do I do this again? Where is view? 1 second, I have to close this because I have to find how to turn it around. Sorry. Okay, I'll try to do this from Orot HaTshuva. How do I turn it around? Here. I might have to paraphrase because of lack of time. Rav Kook says, chutzpah, here they call it impudence. Chutzpah that we encounter, by the way, this is also the Mishnah and Sota, uses that term. The chutzpah which is encountered prior to the coming of the Messiah, which is mentioned in the Mishnah and Sota, derives from the fact that the world is ready for concepts in which all the particulars are linked to the universals, and any particularity not linked with a larger scope of a Weltanschauung does not offer satisfaction. And if people pursue the study of Torah in the spirit to enlarge our spiritual perspective, to recognize the proper connection between the particular and the universals categories of the spiritual, then penitence and the resultant perfection of the world would arise. But because there's negligence in the study of the inner Torah, the result is that there is now frightful nihilism is rampant. What does that mean? For Rav Kook, the chutzpah is the fact that a lot of young Jews are rebelling against Judaism. It appears like a chutzpah because they're brought up in religious homes, sometimes Hasidic homes, and now they're completely secular. But Rav Kook says you have to understand psychologically what's going on here. These are young people who have discovered the big world. They want to hear big ideas. And all they hear about is you'll daven, you'll put on tefillin, you'll eat kosher. But what's the big ideals behind it? That's what they want to know. They want to know the ideas that are standing behind it. How does this perfect mankind? How does this make the Jewish people a people which is progressing? And because they never got answers to their questions, and people told them you're not supposed to ask questions like that, they felt rejected. You had great minds who left yeshivot and sometimes didn't want to, like Bialik, who loved the yeshiva. But he was looking for something which the yeshiva didn't offer him. Rav Kook says it's because we left the study of the inner Torah, which both means the Midrash and the Agadah and Kabbalah, of course. It says the answers we'll find in the inner Torah of how to connect all these details with the big ideas. And as soon as we're successful of doing that and we present that to people, they'll say, okay, that's interesting. It says that's the remedy. But we need people who are able to do that, who are able to say, no, it's not just the nitty gritty. We want you to do this, but not that. It's also connected to ideals. And then people will listen because that's what they want to hear. And that's why they're rebelling. They're not rebelling for the sake of rebelling. They're looking for something greater. They're saying to themselves, if that's what belief in God brings, okay. So you want somebody to explain belief in God in a more profound way, where people say, that's interesting. That's what Rav Kook is saying. We need the people who are able to bring people to that's interesting point. And that's at the point where we start having dialogue, real dialogue. Politics is not for dialogue. We're forcing them to have dialogue, but dialogue happens between people, between thinkers, right? That's where real dialogue takes place. In the academia, or even just among the intelligentsia, among regular people. That's where the real interaction can take place, because every politician has an ulterior motive, but people don't necessarily. Yeah. What else am I going to say? There is more to say, but I was very influenced by Rav Kook in my younger days, but I discovered a lot of things about him too, which really surprised me. Because for a man who grew up, as I said this last week, for a man who grew up in a shtetl, he really understood what was going on in the big world. You would not, based on a lot of things he writes, you would never believe he grew up in a little shtetl next to Boysk in Latvia. Because his thinking really transcended a lot of places. There's a famous story, there's a beautiful thing on Israeli TV on Rav Kook. I forget the name of the MC who does it. And they tell the story how Rav Kook, together with Zonnenfeld, who was the rabbi one of the rabbi of the old Yishuv in Meir Sharim, Rav Kook convinced them to go on a trip to visit the settlements of the kibbutzim and the moshavim in the north. Okay, so Rav Sonnenfeld told her, wanted to teach them Torah. And Rav Kook decided, okay, so they come to this one place where he just had Olim Chadashim, I forget where they're from. And right away, they see Rabbi Kook, Rabbi Sonnenfeld. This is, of course, a secular kibbutz. And they walk in the Chadar Ochel. One guy comes right over Rav Kook and says, if you think you have something to teach us here, you're in the wrong place. And so Rav Kook, without even the blink of an eye, he says, we didn't come here to teach. We came here to learn. Rabbi Sonnenfeld would have never said that. He wasn't that type of guy. But for Rav Kook, he really meant that. He wanted to understand these people. Yeah. Okay, dear friends, we're almost at 7 o'clock. So this is really the end of the series on Rav Kook. We'll take a bit of a break. And Philippe, you'll give me the cue when you think that we should restart. It'll be a break, I think, for what, a week or two, something like that? Or are we talking about longer?
Yes, we can exchange ideas about it and see the activities of participants.
Okay, so next week for sure we're taking a break. It might be one more week. And in the meantime, thank you for joining. And maybe others will join when we come around.
Thank you so much.
The next
Thank you very
the next
much.
series, we'll have to think it shall be. Okay,